The air shimmered with colors she had never seen before, rippling like liquid gemstones across the sky. Leary flattened her translucent wings against her back and crept closer to the edge of the cliff. Below, the human stood. No, not stood-loomed. Even from a distance, his silhouette was wrong. Broad shoulders, long limbs, a stance that suggested either complete calm or terrifying readiness. The legends whispered in the root halls of her people said humans could devour you with their teeth. Alone, that they could drink rivers dry and set forests ablaze just by breathing. And yet, here was one, standing with his back to her, watching the horizon as if the infinite expanse of this alien world belonged to him. The wind carried his, scent strange, sharp, and not unpleasant. Her four hearts hammered in unison. The elders had warned her, if you see a human, run, hide. They will eat you alive. But there was no place to hide here, only open sky and the glittering plains below. The human turned, slowly, as though aware she was there without needing to. See her. His eyes caught the light and flared like molten gold. Leary froze, her clawed toes gripping the rock, waiting for the lunge. But instead, the human smiled, small, almost hesitant curl of his lips and said, in perfect Alari, you look lost. Leary's breath hitched, the sound thin and sharp in the charged air. The human's voice was deep, but not in the thunderous, destructive way she'd imagined rather. It carried a calm weight, as though every word was anchored to some vast ocean beneath his skin. She found herself blinking rapidly, unsure if it was from the wind or the unsettling fact that he knew her language. That was impossible. No human had ever set foot in the crystal ranges of the Alari, and yet here one stood, speaking as if he had learned his first words in the same moss-lit caverns she had. I am not lost, she lied, her voice trembling. The human tilted his head slightly, studying her in a way that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe. His gaze did not roam over her hungrily, nor did his hands twitch toward weapons. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to sit on the cliff's edge, as if inviting her to join him. The sky will break soon, he said, gesturing to the shimmering colors overhead. Storms here are beautiful, but they bite hard. You shouldn't be alone when it happens. Leary hesitated. She had never been this close to a human before, and every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But the curiosity that burned in her chest was louder than her fear. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer, her wings brushing the air with a whisper, wondering what kind of predator warned their prey about the storm. The cliffside wind howled louder now, carrying the scent of ozone and the faint metallic temps of an oncoming crystal storm. Leary's talons clicked softly on the stone as she edged closer, her every movement deliberate, ready to leap back at the first flicker of threat. The human, this impossible figure of bone and muscle wrapped in strange woven coverings, not moved to intercept her. His posture remained steady, almost ceremonial, as though he understood that in Alari culture, rushing an approach was a declaration of aggression. She noticed details she had not dared examine before, the faint scars running along his forearms, too straight to be from claws, but too ragged to be from blades. The texture of his coverings, layered fabrics that looked heavy enough to shield against more than cold. And his hands broad, blunt-fingered, calloused in ways that spoke of both creation and destruction. His eyes followed her, but without that sharp predator's greed she'd been taught to expect. If anything, they looked concerned. You don't believe me, he said, as if plucking the thought straight from her skull. I can't blame you. Your people have heard stories. Leary's wing muscles twitched at the understatement. Stories. They were more like survival scripture's cautionary chants for hatchlings, painting humans as night terrors who could strip a soul from its shell in moments. Why are you here? She asked, voice low and taut as a bowstring. The human didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his side, not threatening, and withdrew something small wrapped in cloth. With deliberate care, he set it between them on the rock. When the wind teased the cloth aside, hearts skipped. Inside was a shard of star crystal, glowing with the deep blue of her homeworld's core. No off-worlder should have had such a thing. I came to return this, he said quietly, and in his voice was not hunger, but a strange, disarming sincerity that made her forget, for the first time in her life, to be afraid. The shard's glow pulsed faintly, as if recognizing her, and the light painted the human's weathered face in shades of blue and silver. Leary couldn't tear her gaze from it. Star crystal was more than rare, it was sacred. Each shard was a fragment of the great core, the heart of the Alari homeworld, split during the sundering and scattered across the galaxy like the bones of a god. Possession of one by an outsider was not just impossible, it was heresy. Yet here, it was resting in human hands, offered to her as casually as a wildflower. Her claws curled against the rock, torn between reaching for it and keeping her distance. Where did you get that? She whispered, though the storm was building fast, and her voice almost vanished in the growing roar. The human's eyes didn't waver. From a ship, he said, that fell from your sky, burning. His voice carried a gravity that made her skin tighten. Everyone else was dead when I found it. Everyone except a child who could barely breathe. Leary's wings shuddered, involuntarily. The memory was not hers, yet the words stirred something buried. I didn't know your language then, he continued, but I knew enough to keep the crystal safe. I promised her I'd bring it home when she was ready. He paused, the faintest shadow crossing his features. She never got the chance. Leary blinked hard, confusion warring with disbelief. You're lying. Humans don't. She cut herself off. She was going to say, don't save people like us. But there was something in his face that made the words feel brittle and false. This wasn't the expression of a hunter toying with prey, it was the look of someone who had carried a weight too long. The wind surged, rattling the crystal shard so it hummed like a distant bell. The colors in the sky were folding inward now. A sure sign the storm front was seconds away from tearing through the plateau. Without warning, the human rose to his feet and extended a hand not with command, but with quiet urgency. If you stay here, you'll die, he said. Come with me. I'll get you through the storm. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Every tale said to flee, to fight, to vanish if a human offered you anything. And yet when she looked at him, standing there with the star crystal between them and the sky about to break open, Leary felt the first crack in the wall of fear she had carried all her life. She didn't know if she was stepping toward safety or straight into the jaws of a predator. But the storm was coming fast, and so, trembling, she reached for his hand. The moment her clawed fingers touched his, she expected to feel the crushing grip of a predator, the iron strength the stories had promised, something final, inescapable. Instead, his hand closed around hers with surprising care, firm enough to anchor her against the cliff's whipping winds, but not enough to bruise. The contact was warm, radiating through her thin skin, almost unsettling after a lifetime of avoiding touch with anything not of her kind. His palm was rough, ridged with calluses that spoke of labor, of tools wielded, of battles fought, but there was a steadiness there that made her claws loosen fractionally. The wind screamed now, carrying flecks of crystal dust that cut at the skin like invisible blades. Above them, the shimmering sky twisted violently, its liquid colors hardening into jagged lightning veins of violet and gold. The human didn't wait for her to decide further. He turned and began guiding her down a narrow path that clung to the cliff face, moving with an efficiency that made her realize he'd mapped this terrain long before she had appeared. Every step was placed without hesitation, every shift of his weight calculated to counter the gusts. "Keep your wings tight," he called over the storm's rising voice. "The currents will tear them if you open them here." The warning was sharp but not cruel, and she obeyed instinctively, folding them against her back until the edges ached. They moved in bursts, darting between outcroppings that broke the wind. At one turn, a sheet of rainsparks water, infused with microscopic crystal, lashed across the path, glowing faintly as it struck the rock. Leary hissed as one droplet grazed her cheek, leaving a shallow burn, but the human was already shielding her with his body, taking the brunt without a sound. His woven coverings smoked faintly from the contact, yet he didn't falter. Between heartbeats, she found herself watching the way he moved, not with the cold efficiency of a hunter, but the unyielding momentum of someone who had carried others to safety before. His every action contradicted the warnings drilled into her since hatchlinghood. There was no hunger in his eyes, no gloating in his voice-only focus, and something dangerously close to protectiveness. At last, they reached a cleft in the cliffside, a narrow gap leading into darkness. He ushered her inside first, then followed, bracing a slab of stone against the opening. The instant the wind was shut out, the silence was almost violent. The space was small, lit only by the faint blue glow of the star crystal, now in her trembling grasp. The human stood in the dimness, Rainspark still clinging to his shoulders like fallen stars. "You'll be safe here," he said, voice quieter now, yet carrying the same unshakable certainty. "The storm will pass by morning." Leary pressed herself back against the stone wall, breathing hard. The scent of Rainspark and the unfamiliar warmth of him filled the shelter, wrapping around her thoughts. Every instinct told her to keep her distance, to remember the chants of the elders. But the image of him standing in the storm, shielding her without hesitation, burned brighter than the fear. For the first time, she wondered not if the stories were wrong, but if they had only ever told half the truth. The shelter's darkness, pressed in close, the only illumination, the slow, rhythmic throb of the star crystal's glow cupped in her claws. Its light was alive, crawling over the human's features and casting him in the strange, almost sacred radiance of her people's lifeblood. She could see him clearly now, the small lines etched at the corners of his eyes from squinting into suns or smiling too often, the pale scars that trailed along his jaw like faded constellations, the faint rise and fall of his chest as he drew in measured breaths. He stood in the center of the narrow space, hands loose at his sides, posture relaxed yet utterly aware of every shift in the wind outside, every creak of rock above them. She realized he had placed himself between her and the mouth of the shelter, not to block her escape, but to stand guard. Leary sank to a crouch, her folded wings aching from restraint. The air inside was warmer than the storm, yet it carried that sharp, metallic tang of Rainspark, mingled now with something distinctly human, earthy scent like sun-warmed soil after a long drought. She tried not to breathe it in, but each inhalation drew more of it into her lungs, unsettling in its foreignness. Her hearts were still hammering, though not entirely from fear. "You could have let me die," she said at last, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. The human tilted his head slightly, studying her in silence before answering. "I could have," he agreed, and the blunt honesty of it made her scales prickle. "But I didn't." "Why?" The question burst from her, sharper than she meant, carrying all the weight of centuries of warnings, all the disbelief that had taken root in her from hatchlinghood. He shifted his weight, leaning one shoulder against the rock. "Because where I come from," he said slowly, "we don't leave people to die just because they're different, or because someone told us a story about what they might do." His gaze didn't waver from hers. "I've seen too many friends fall because someone decided their kind was dangerous before they ever spoke a word." The words scraped against her thoughts like claws on crystal. No one spoke like this, not to her, not about her people. "Your kind hunts," she said, almost defensively, as if to reassert the structure of the world she understood. "You take what you want, you conquer." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite anger. "Some do," he admitted. "Some of mine are everything you've been told, and worse. But that's not all we are. The galaxy likes to make monsters out of the unfamiliar." He glanced toward the faint gap in the stone where the stormlight flickered. "Sometimes we help. Sometimes we build. And sometimes we carry pieces of home for someone who can't go back." Her eyes fell to the crystal in her hands. It was warmer now, reacting to her touch, the glow deepening as if remembering who it belonged to. "The child," she said softly. "The one you spoke of before. She was Alari." He nodded once. "Her name was Sirai. She didn't talk much to hurt, too scared, but she trusted me enough to give me that before she—" He stopped, swallowing the rest, his gaze distant for a heartbeat. "I promised her I'd see it home. I didn't think it would take this long." Leary felt something shift inside her, a fault line cracking through the bedrock of what she believed. The storm outside raged against the stone like a living thing, but in the shelter's stillness she was aware only of the sound of his breathing and the faint pulse of the She should be planning her escape. She should be calculating how to survive until morning without letting him too close. Instead, she found herself wanting to know more, not just about the crystal, but about him. "You could be lying," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He didn't flinch. "I could be, but I'm not." The wind howled louder, and the rock around them shivered under its force. Without thinking, Leary shifted closer to the crystal's glow and to him. The human noticed, but said nothing. He simply sat down on the cold stone floor, close enough for her to feel the faint heat radiating from his skin, and leaned back against the wall as though they'd done this 100 times before. And in that moment, with the storm outside like the roar of some great beast and the crystal's light weaving their shadows together, she realized the elders' stories had prepared her for teeth and claws and blood, but they had not prepared her for this, the terrifying, impossible possibility that a human's strength could be used to protect rather than destroy. The storm did not pass quickly. It settled over the mountains like some colossal predator laying claim to its kill, pressing down with weight and noise that seemed intent on shaking the world apart. Rainspark hissed and spat against the stone, each droplet a searing spark as it struck the cliff face outside. Somewhere above, the sky split with a blinding fracture of light that poured through the narrow crevice in the rock for a heartbeat before darkness reclaimed it. The air inside the shelter felt thick, not just from the heat of their bodies in close quarters, but from the unspoken truths crowding the small space between them. Leary kept her wings folded tight, though the muscles burned from hours of compression. She sat with the star crystal in her lap, its glow softening the shadows and glinting along the edges of her scales. Every so often, she caught the human watching it. No, not the crystal, her with an expression she could not read. It wasn't the greedy gleam of someone longing for a prize. It was closer to the look of a weary traveler who stumbled across something precious and feared he might lose it again. You said the child's name was Sarai. She began, testing the name on her tongue. It felt oddly familiar, like an echo of a half-forgotten lullaby. What happened to her? The human's gaze dropped to the stone floor. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter than before. She was hurt when I found her. The ship she was on, it was hit. No survivors but her. I tried to keep her alive, but he trailed off, eyes narrowing, as if fighting to keep some memory contained. She died in my arms before I even learned her full name. His hands flexed once against his knees, then stilled. But she made me promise, swore I'd take the crystal back to her people. I've been trying ever since. Leary wanted to challenge him, to demand proof, but the rawness in his voice was proof enough. He was telling the truth, she felt it, though she couldn't have explained why. Why risk so much for someone you barely knew? He leaned back against the wall, eyes closing for a moment. Because I've been that someone, he said finally. Lost, outnumbered, too far from home to call for help. Once, someone pulled me out when they had every reason to walk away. I guess I've been trying to repay that debt ever since. Silence stretched, filled only by the growl of the storm. Leary turned the crystal in her claws, watching its light play across the walls. And what would you have done, she asked slowly, if I'd attacked you when we first met? One corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. Dodged, he said. Maybe taken a hit. Then kept talking until you realized I wasn't here to hurt you. That's foolish, she murmured. Maybe, he agreed, without hesitation. But it works more often than you'd think. Outside, the storm's fury reached its peak. The cliff trembled under a strike so close it made the air inside the shelter vibrate in her chest. Instinctively, she pressed herself back against the stone and realized she was also pressing closer to him. She expected him to shift away, to reassert some unspoken barrier, but he didn't. Instead, he simply shifted his arms slightly, creating a space where she could brace herself without her wingtips scraping the wall. Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. The hours stretched, the storm's voice rising and falling, until her eyelids grew heavy despite her best efforts to remain alert. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was the human, still seated by the entrance, eyes fixed on the outside world, as if standing watch over them both. And somewhere deep in the tangle of her thoughts, she realized she no longer feared waking to find his teeth at her throat. The real danger, she thought hazily, was waking to find him gone. When Leary woke, the shelter was dim and still. The star crystal's glow faded to a quiet ember in her lap. For a moment she thought the storm had passed entirely, but then she realized the silence was not peace, was the eerie pause between strikes, the breath a predator takes before lunging. The air was charged, her scales prickling with static, and somewhere in the distance she could hear a low, rolling growl that was not thunder. The human was already awake. He was crouched near the entrance, peering through the narrow crack of stone, his posture tense in a way that told her the danger was no longer in the sky. His hand rested on some kind of weapon at his side, not drawn yet, but ready. His other hand lifted slightly as he caught her movement, a silent signal to stay. "Still, what is it?" she whispered, every instinct telling her to fold herself into the darkest corner and vanish. His gaze stayed fixed outside. "We're not alone." Her pulse quickened. "Another human? No." His voice was low, edged with steel. "Worse." She shifted forward just enough to glimpse through the crack, and her stomach tightened. Down on the lower ledge, partially obscured by the jagged rock, 3 figures moved in a slow, deliberate formation. They weren't a lorry too broad, too heavy. Their skin glinted like hammered bronze, their movements predatory but efficient. She recognized them immediately from whispered campfire tales, the Chevron mercenaries who traded in lives and secrets, feared by every species with something to lose. And if they were here, they were hunting. "They can't have tracked me," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "They didn't," the human said grimly. "They're here for the crystal." Her heart lurched. Of course, a shard of the great core was worth more than most fleets enough to buy a planet. "Or burn one. They'll scent it," she said, glancing at the dim glow in her claws. He nodded once. "Which is why we move now." She stared at him. "Move into that." He finally turned to meet her gaze, and there was no room for argument in his expression. "If we wait, they'll box us in. Out there, at least, I can choose the ground." He slung a pack over his shoulder, then extended his hand again, as he had on the cliff before the storm. "You trust me yet?" The question struck harder than she expected. Did she? She had no proof he wouldn't use her as bait, no reason beyond a night's shared shelter to believe his intentions were pure. And yet, the memory of him shielding her from the rain spark of his steady voice in the chaos made her fingers twitch toward his without conscious thought. Her claws slid into his palm. "Lead the way," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. They slipped out into the dawner, false dawn, lit not by the sun but by the storm's strange afterlight. The world was washed in hues of violet and gold, every surface glistening with crystal dust. The Chafron was still below, their heavy boots crunching faintly as they prowled the ledge. The human didn't take the obvious path. Instead, he led her along a narrow ridge that clung to the cliff face, moving with quiet precision. Every muscle in her body screamed with the need to fly, to simply lift into the sky and vanish. But his earlier warning about the currents still held opening her wings here would be a death sentence. So she followed, every step a calculated gamble, the crystal warm against her chest, and for the first time since meeting him, she realized that whatever happened next, their fates were now bound together. The first shout went up behind them, guttural, metallic, carrying the bite of a hunter who's caught the scent. Lyri's talons scraped stone as she quickened her pace, the star crystal thudding against her chest with every step. The human didn't look back. He only glanced over his shoulder once to check her distance, then pushed them faster along the Niftin Ridge. The air still churned with leftover storm currents, sharp gusts that threatened to peel them from the cliff. A second shout answered the first, closer now, and the crunch of boots on crystal dust sent a cold spike down her spine. The Chafron were gaining. "They're faster than you said," she hissed between breaths. "They're not faster," he said without turning. "We're leading them." She blinked, her instincts screaming at the absurdity of it. "What you'll see." The path bent sharply, curling around a massive crystal outcrop that jutted from the cliff like a frozen wave. The human darted into its shadow, then suddenly shoved her toward a narrow crevice in the rock. Inside, now. She slipped in, pressing herself flat against the stone. He remained outside, crouching low, one hand brushing the cliff face like he was reading it. Then she saw the glint of metal in his grip, compact, angular, and humming faintly with restrained energy. The Shathron rounded the bend, heavy frames gleaming. The lead hunter spotted him instantly and raised its weapon, but the human moved first. The device in his hand erupted in a sharp, concussive pulse-knot light. Not fire, but sound, so dense it made the air warp. The blast struck the cliff beneath the Shathron's feet, fracturing the crystal stone into 1,000 razor-edged shards. With a crack like breaking bone, the ledge gave way, sending 2 of the mercenaries plummeting into the mist below. The third was faster, leaping back to a stable section, but it also made the mistake of locking eyes with the human. And for the first time, Leary saw what the stories meant. There was something in his gaze, a cold, unflinching precision that measured the exact moment to strike. He closed the distance in a blur, striking low to drive the butt of his weapon into the Shathron's knee joint. The mercenary went down, hard, and before it could recover, the human twisted the weapon and delivered a crackling discharge that sent the creature limp to the ground. Silence, except for the wind. He turned to her, breathing steady despite the fight. They won't follow. For a while, let's move. She stepped out of the crevice slowly, her eyes locked on him in a way that wasn't entirely voluntary. She had heard the elders speak of human violence, like it was a mindless storm, brutal, indiscriminate. But what she had just witnessed wasn't mindless at all. It was calculated, surgical. He had chosen every strike for maximum effect with minimum waste, and when it was over, he simply walked away. "You planned this," she said quietly. "Of course," he replied. "Running blind gets you killed. I like to pick where the fight happens." She followed him in silence after that. The image of his eyes in that moment seared into her memory. She was no longer sure which was more dangerous, the Shathron hunting them, or the human walking just ahead of her. The path wound downward into a valley carved from ancient stone, where the last breath of the storm lingered as a glittering haze. Every surface shimmered faintly, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet crystal and something older, like the earth itself had been stirred awake. Leary's legs ached from the climb, her wings sore from being pressed tight for so long. But the human's pace never faltered. He moved with the kind of relentless determination that made her realize there would be no stopping until they reached whatever destination he had set in his mind. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where a pool of water mirrored the fractured sky. At its center stood a stone altar, worn smooth by centuries, and etched with the curling script of the Alari tongue. Leary's breath caught. "This is a shrine," she whispered, from before the sundering. The human nodded once, setting his pack down beside the altar. "Sarai told me where to find it. Said it was the only place her people would accept the crystal back without question." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to approach. Her claws felt suddenly clumsy as she held the star crystal, its glow now steady and strong.